Throughout history, the Bible has been more than a sacred book. It has served as a map of mysteries, hidden symbols, and secrets buried between its lines. Today, we won't speak of what everyone already knows, but of that which has remained in the shadows. Cities that vanished, forgotten prophecies, figures erased from record, and stories that still challenge science and history today. Close your eyes, relax, and join me on this silent journey through the greatest mysteries of biblical history. The mystery of the Magi. Who were they really and where did they come from? Among the most evocative stories in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' birth, few have sparked as much fascination, debate, and symbolic beauty as that of the Magi. Often depicted in nativity scenes crowned and astride camels, bearing mysterious gifts, their image has endured through the centuries as a blend of history, theology, and popular tradition. Yet behind that picturesque tableau lies a veil of mystery as dense as the frankincense they carried. Who were these men in truth? Why did they undertake such a long journey guided only by a star? And what deeper meaning does their presence hold in the nativity narrative? The first thing that strikes anyone who reads the Gospels is how little is actually said about them. The Gospel of Matthew, the only canonical source to mention them, does not call them kings nor specify that there were three. It merely refers to Magi who came from the east. In the original Greek, Magi could mean sages, astrologers, or priests of Eastern religions, particularly Persia, not necessarily monarchs. This ambiguity opened the door to centuries of interpretations, inventions, and cultural adaptations that recast these enigmatic visitors as symbols of power, wisdom, and exoticism. In the early centuries of Christianity, the number of Magi varied wildly, from 2 to 12 in different accounts. It was not until the Middle Ages that 3 became the standard, probably to match the 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each held deep spiritual symbolism: gold for a king, frankincense for a deity, and myrrh for a mortal destined to die. This theological reading elevated the Magi beyond mere travelers. They became heralds of the newborn child's divine destiny, able to recognize in him what even his own people failed to see. Their geographic origin also drew much speculation. From the east has been understood as Mesopotamia, Arabia, Persia, or even India. In many ancient cultures, there existed learned castes who studied the heavens, interpreted celestial signs, and believed the stars conveyed divine messages. The Gospel reports that the Magi saw his star in the east and followed it to Jerusalem, testimony not only to advanced astronomical knowledge but also to a profound conviction that cosmic movements mirrored earthly events. In an age when the sky was read like sacred scripture, an unusual star could herald the birth of a king, the dawn of a new era, or the incarnation of the divine on earth. What makes the story truly powerful is that the Magi represent not only wisdom but also the quest for truth. Strangers to the Jewish faith, they nonetheless recognize the child's significance. They traverse deserts, guided by an uncertain light, bearing gifts for which they expect no reward. It's a striking image, outsiders perceiving the truth before the very guardians of the law. In that paradox lies a subtle but potent critique of the religious leaders of the day, those who, despite possessing the scriptures, failed to see what pagan sages could discern. During the medieval period, these Magi were given names: Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, and portrayed with different ages and ethnic traits, underscoring the universality of Jesus' message. No longer just wise men, they became representatives of all humanity united in worship of the child. This cultural evolution shows how the Christian tradition layered new meanings onto the original account over time. Some historians have even sought historical figures as the Magi's inspiration. Persian Zoroastrian priests called Magi were famed for their celestial studies. Babylonian astrologers enjoyed high status at court as interpreters of omens. Perhaps Matthew intended to show that even the sages of foreign lands recognized Jesus' importance. If so, this is less a strict historical note than a theological declaration. The Messiah was born not for one nation but for all. The star that guided them has also fueled modern astronomical theories. Planetary conjunctions, comets, or supernovae around 6 to 7 BCE. Yet the Gospel says only the Magi saw the star, suggesting it may have been as much a visionary sign for the prepared heart as a purely physical phenomenon. Thus, the star becomes a symbol of spiritual intuition, the power to perceive the invisible. Their arrival in Jerusalem alarms King Herod, who summons his own scholars. That the Magi first consult earthly power before finding the divine path adds a political dimension. The quest for the sacred often must pass through the maze of earthly authority. Finally, guided again by the star, they reach Bethlehem and present their gifts. Warned in a dream, they return home by another route, an echo that once you glimpse truth, you cannot retrace the old path. The mystery of the Magi remains open to interpretation, enriched by art, faith, and imagination. They are soul travelers, tireless seekers of meaning in a dark world. Their story not only adorns the nativity tale but reminds us that truth sometimes comes from afar, lands and voices we might least expect, and that those who seek with their hearts ultimately find their way, even across deserts, silences, and guiding stars. The birth of Jesus and the Roman census. Did it really take place? In the opening chapters of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' birth is framed within a political administrative context that has sparked centuries of wonder and controversy. According to the account, Joseph and Mary, residents of Nazareth, were forced to travel to Bethlehem because of a census decreed by the Roman emperor. That journey, with Mary heavily pregnant and about to give birth, is one of the most depicted scenes in religious art and one of the richest in symbolism. Yet, when we view it through a historical lens rather than purely faith, questions emerge. Did this census truly happen? Is it a documented historical event or a narrative device meant to tie Jesus to Old Testament prophecy? The first thing to note is that Luke's Gospel is the only New Testament text to mention this imperial census as the reason for Joseph and Mary's pilgrimage to Bethlehem. He says Emperor Augustus ordered the whole known world to be registered, and that this occurred while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This precise naming of historical figures fuels debate, because surviving Roman records do not align neatly with Luke's details. Augustus did conduct censuses in various provinces during his reign, but there is no record of an empire-wide registration at the time Jesus is thought to have been born. And Quirinius' census in Judea took place around the year 6 of the Common Era, more than a decade after the death of Herod the Great, which is generally dated to the year 4 before the beginning of the Common Era. How could both references be true if the dates lie so far apart? This chronological gap is no minor miscalculation but a fundamental tension between Luke's narrative framework and the historical sources we possess. Scholars who try to harmonize the two suggest possibilities: an earlier unrecorded census, a confusion of governors, or that Luke's goal was not to chronicle events with modern precision but to craft a theological message. After all, Luke was not a historian in our sense. His priority was showing that Jesus' birth fulfilled ancient messianic promises, and for that to happen, he had to be born in David's city, Bethlehem. Moreover, the very mechanism of the census Luke describes raises eyebrows. He implies that everyone registered in the town of their ancestors, so Joseph would go to Bethlehem as a descendant of David. Yet, in Roman practice, censuses were conducted where people actually lived, not in distant ancestral hometowns. They were fiscal surveys, counts for tax and land purposes, not pilgrimages back to family origins. Would hundreds of thousands really uproot themselves just to satisfy an administrative formality? It is also striking that such a sweeping census leaves no trace in other contemporary sources. Roman chroniclers like Tacitus, Suetonius, or Cassius Dio, who meticulously recorded imperial affairs, never mention a mass registration that triggered widespread migrations. Nor do archaeology or provincial archives show evidence of such an event. If any local head counts occurred, they were likely far smaller than Luke implies. Compare Luke with Matthew and the differences multiply. Matthew never mentions a census. In his account, Joseph and Mary already live in Bethlehem. After the Magi's visit and Herod's deadly threat, the family flees to Egypt. No journey from Nazareth, no enrollment mandate, no forced return to Galilee under census orders. Which version should we regard as history? Must each gospel be read literally, or as distinct theological portraits of the same event? Here, the symbolic power of Luke's census narrative comes into focus. Even if the details do not match every archive, including the Census, drives home a profound truth. Jesus' birth was not an isolated incident nor the private whim of an obscure family. It unfolded against the backdrop of imperial power. Rome's greatest symbol of earthly rule unwittingly becomes the instrument that fulfills divine prophecy. Thus, Joseph and Mary's journey stands for more than bureaucratic compliance. It becomes an inward and outward pilgrimage, a movement of the voiceless, the humble on the move, those unwelcomed by-ins yet carrying the seed of something transformative. What were the evangelist's intentions? What did that forced march, that return to origins, that lack of shelter signify? Beyond literal historicity, the story paints human fragility amid systems blind to individual need. The couple walks on, burdened by exhaustion, uncertainty, and imminent childbirth. No one awaits them. No one opens a door. Yet in that margin where privilege and welcome fail, a life emerges that, for Christians, will change the course of history. We may question whether the census happened as described, whether Quirinius was governing at that time, or whether the journey was required or symbolic. But even if the particulars are not strictly historical, the narrative's power endures. Behind every apparent mismatch lies a timeless image, vulnerable humanity on the move, finding meaning amid displacement. Perhaps that is why Luke's account still resonates, because each of us has, at some point, walked uncertainly, not knowing if a place to stay awaited us. The Star of Bethlehem. At the heart of one of the oldest and most retold stories in the Christian tradition lies an image that has crossed centuries and cultures with the same glow it was said to have cast upon the earth. A star that guided wise men from distant lands to a newborn child in a small Judean village. The Star of Bethlehem, a silent protagonist of the nativity narrative, has fascinated generations not only for its symbolic radiance, but also for the mystery it carries. What was that light that appeared in the sky? Was it truly an extraordinary astronomical event, or a supernatural manifestation that defied the laws of the known universe? From a narrative standpoint, the star is far more than a simple scenic element. It is the thread that links territories, cultures, and timelines. Its appearance in the Gospel of Matthew does not merely place the story in a cosmic context. It grants the birth of Jesus a universal dimension. It is not the scribes nor the temple priests who first recognize the arrival of the Messiah, but foreign sages who read the heavens with trained eyes. And it is that star shining above them that becomes a sign, a call, a path. Historically, the passage that describes the Star of Bethlehem is brief, even sparse, yet sufficient to ignite the imagination. It says that the wise men, upon seeing it, understood that the King of the Jews had been born, and they followed it to Jerusalem. From there, guided by new clues, they arrived in Bethlehem. The text indicates that the star went ahead of them and stood over the place where the child was. These expressions have led to a wide array of interpretations, from literal readings describing a moving star or comet, to symbolic ones in which the star is seen as spiritual intuition, an inner guide made manifest as light. For centuries, astronomers, theologians, and historians have attempted to find a factual basis for this phenomenon. One of the most studied hypotheses is the possibility of a planetary conjunction. Around the year 7 before the commonly accepted starting point of the current era, there was a rare triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces. This uncommon event might have caught the attention of sky watchers, particularly in cultures such as Babylon, where astrology played a central role. For some scholars, this conjunction could have been interpreted as a sign of the birth of an important leader, especially in the region of Judea, which was symbolically associated with the constellation of Pisces. Another proposed possibility is the appearance of a comet, such as Halley's Comet, which was visible around the year 12 before the current era began. However, in the ancient world, comets were generally considered bad omens, harbingers of disaster or death. It would therefore seem strange that a story celebrating such a sacred birth would be introduced with a sign perceived as ominous. Others have suggested it might have been a nova or a supernova, that is, a stellar explosion visible to the naked eye. Such events, though rare, have been recorded throughout history and often interpreted as divine messages by multiple cultures. Yet here, too, difficulties arise. There are no known astronomical records from Chinese, Babylonian, or Egyptian sources that match both the description and the estimated date of Jesus' birth. Beyond scientific explanations, there are those who affirm that the Star of Bethlehem was, at its core, a divine intervention. A sign sent by God, not bound by natural laws but expressly designed to herald a unique moment in human history. From this perspective, the star needs no astronomical explanation. Its existence is an act of divine will, and its purpose is primarily spiritual. Its light does not shine for everyone, only for those who are able to read it, like the wise men from the east. In this reading, the star does not belong to the physical sky, but to the symbolic sky of the human soul, to that space where the eternal manifests in the visible. Whatever the case may be, the fact remains that the story of the star has endured with unusual strength. No matter how briefly it is mentioned in the sacred texts, its presence has inspired paintings, hymns, popular tales, and even observatories. For many, it represents the spark of revelation that breaks through the darkness. The promise that, high above, in the midst of the night, an unexpected sign can appear. A light that guides toward meaning, toward destiny, toward the sacred. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this mystery is that it does not need resolution to hold its power. In a world obsessed with explaining everything, with drawing clear lines around every phenomenon, the Star of Bethlehem continues to escape conventional categories. It may have been a real astronomical event or a literary device with theological intent. It may have been a comet, a vision, a shared dream, or a metaphor. But what matters is not so much its exact nature as what it represents. The star is the bridge between what is above and what is below, between the distant and the near, between the vastness of the universe and the intimacy of a manger. In this sense, its value lies not in what it was, but in what it provoked. It set sages in motion, awakened seekers, opened paths. It was seen by attentive eyes, read by open minds, followed by willing hearts. It was not just another star in the sky. It was a sign full of meaning, and that makes it eternal, because beyond astronomical coordinates, its light continues to shine in every sincere search, in every journey toward what is not seen but felt. The Star of Bethlehem, then, is not only in the heavens. It is within us, each time we choose to follow the direction of something that calls to us from the depths. The hidden childhood of Jesus. Among the most enigmatic passages of the Gospels, few are as unsettling and at the same time as revealing as the silence that surrounds the childhood and youth of Jesus. In the canonical accounts, we move from his miraculous birth in Bethlehem and the visit of the wise men to a solitary scene in the Temple of Jerusalem when the boy is 12 years old. After that, nothing. A narrative void stretches for nearly 2 decades, until suddenly, Jesus appears as an adult of about 30, preaching in Galilee, performing miracles, and proclaiming the kingdom of God. What happened during all that time? Where was he? What did he learn? What experiences shaped the character and consciousness of the one whom millions consider the savior of the world? This blank space has been fertile ground for imagination, speculation, and in many cases, faith. The Gospels make no attempt to fill that gap. They leave it there open, as if those years were reserved for the intimacy of the human, for the fragility of growth, for a silent learning that did not need to be narrated. But silence also speaks, and sometimes it shouts, because every untold year is an invitation to wonder not only about the story of Jesus, but also about his humanity. Many scholars agree that Jesus must have led a relatively ordinary life during his childhood and youth. He lived in a small Galilean town called Nazareth, far from the noise of Jerusalem and the centers of Roman power. His family was humble and hard-working. His father, Joseph, according to tradition, was a carpenter, although the original word tekton might also mean stonemason or general artisan. This suggests that Jesus would have grown up in an environment of physical labor, of practical trades, surrounded by tools, wood, and stone. A childhood marked by simplicity, but also by the observation of a complex and sometimes unjust world. The fact that the Gospels do not recount episodes from his adolescence does not mean that they were insignificant. Rather, it could indicate that the Gospel writers considered the essential part of his story to begin with his public ministry. However, throughout the centuries, texts outside the canon have emerged that attempt to fill that silence. Some apocryphal Gospels, such as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, depict scenes where a young Jesus performs wonders, some even disturbing, such as shaping clay birds that come to life. These stories, although rich in symbolism, were rejected by the official tradition for not fitting the coherent and restrained image of the Messiah. But their existence reveals a deep, almost primal desire to know more about that overlooked period. And it wasn't just apocryphal texts that dared to imagine. There are also traditions, some oral and others written centuries later, which claim that Jesus traveled beyond the borders of Palestine. It has been said that he was in Egypt, Persia, India, and even Tibet. Some mystical schools affirm that he studied with Eastern sages, that he became familiar with Buddhist teachings, that he engaged with other forms of spirituality in a quest for deeper understanding. While there is no solid historical evidence to support these versions, their persistence shows a universal longing to see Jesus not only as the Son of God, but also as a seeker, a learner, a young man in formation. It is difficult to imagine that the man who taught with such authority, who challenged norms with such wisdom, who spoke in parables with disarming depth, had not gone through a long and silent inner process. Every word he spoke in his public life seemed to come from a deep well, from a maturity acquired not only through divine inspiration but also through experience. The Jesus that appears in the Gospels does not improvise. He speaks with conviction, acts with purpose, and understands human suffering as someone who has lived it or at least witnessed it up close. That capacity for empathy, for seeing others' pain without judgment, for understanding fear, poverty, rejection. Such depth is rarely born in an instant. It is the fruit of years of journeying. We might imagine a teenage Jesus questioning the suffering of his people, listening to the stories of the elders in the streets of Nazareth, seeing the cruelty of the empire firsthand, feeling the tension between religious law and compassion. Perhaps we picture him working beside his father, his hands covered in dust, learning the value of effort, the silence of patience. Or maybe we see him wandering alone into the desert, contemplating the stars in search of signs, wondering what role he was meant to play in a broken world. The Jewish culture of his time would have also left a deep imprint. Jesus grew up in an environment where the study of the Torah was central, where religious festivals marked the rhythm of life, where questions about God were part of everyday conversation. He was not removed from debates between Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. He did not live isolated from social tensions or resistance movements. And within that quiet yet boiling environment, his identity was formed. A unique identity that would later express itself with a blend of gentleness, defiance, and truth. But perhaps the greatest mystery of his childhood lies not in what he did, but in why we do not know it. Silence can be a form of protection. Perhaps those years were so deeply human, so ordinary, so similar to those of anyone else, that the gospel writers, in telling the sacred story, chose to omit them so as not to diminish the divine. Or, on the contrary, perhaps the silence hides what is most revealing, that God chose to grow, not to appear fully formed, that the Savior of the world was also once a child, that he too had doubts, that he too learned to speak, to walk, to love. The hidden childhood of Jesus confronts us because it invites us to see the formation of the Spirit as a process. It tells us that even the one who would redeem the world went through the darkness of what is unspoken, through the slowness of growth, through the mystery of time. And perhaps therein lies the greatest teaching, that the sacred is also born in the ordinary, that greatness begins in smallness, that silence is part of the journey, and that the years that go uncounted may be the most important of all. The Temple of Jerusalem. Few structures have borne as much symbolic weight as the Temple of Jerusalem. More than a building, it was the beating heart of a people, the invisible axis of an identity woven between history and faith, between resistance and revelation. Situated on the sacred hill of Mount Moriah, where, according to tradition, Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son, the temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the architectural embodiment of a promise, the physical expression of a covenant between God and his people. In the time of Jesus, the temple dominated not only the physical skyline of Jerusalem, but also the spiritual, political, and emotional life of all Judea. To speak of the temple is not to speak only of stone. It was a world unto itself. Its courtyards, gates, and corridors echoed with prayers, chants, debates, offerings, Torah readings, the sound of the shofar, the bleating of animals, and the murmur of pilgrims. Jews from across the known world came to it, especially during major festivals. It was the place to which one always returned, like returning to one's origin, to the sacred home from which no soul ever truly departs. But the temple in the days of Jesus was not the same as the one built by Solomon, David's son. That first temple had been destroyed centuries earlier by the Babylonians. The second temple, rebuilt after the exile, lacked at first the splendor of its predecessor, until Herod the Great, with his ambition and obsession for legacy, undertook a massive expansion and beautification project that transformed it into one of the marvels of the ancient world. Herod, who was not beloved by the people, sought legitimacy through power and architecture. Under his rule, the temple became a blend of imperial grandeur and ancestral devotion, a place that reflected both Roman majesty and Jewish messianic longing. From atop the temple, one could see the desert stretching to the east and the bustle of the market below. On its steps, priests mingled with merchants, scribes with beggars, children ran between columns, and elders debated the law. It was impossible to separate the sacred from the everyday. Sacrifices were performed there, incense was burned, and complex rituals were observed, managed only by the Levites. But taxes were also collected there, gestures were monitored, alliances negotiated. The temple was the house of God, yes, but also the center of control for the Sanhedrin, the place where faith and power danced together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in tension. For Jesus, the temple carried a deep, ambivalent, and at times confrontational significance. As a child, he visited it with his parents, as any devout Jew would. As a young man, he likely listened to the rabbis and marveled at the building's beauty. But as a teacher, his relationship with the temple turned more critical. The Gospels tell us that he drove out the merchants from the courtyard, overturning the tables of the money changers and declaring that the temple was meant to be a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. It was more than a protest against commerce. It was a denunciation of a religious system that had lost the heart of its mission, justice, compassion, humility. In that symbolic act, Jesus did not attack the temple itself, but what it had come to represent. He did not repudiate faith, but its exploitation. His action was prophetic, and like all prophetic acts, it was uncomfortable. It touched a sensitive nerve, challenged the established order. Because the temple was also power, and like all power, it feared those who questioned it from within. That confrontation, for many, was one of the decisive moments that sealed his fate. The temple, in all its magnificence, was also an open wound. While it reflected the glory of God, it also reminded the people of their fragility. It had been destroyed once and would be again, only a few decades after Jesus' death, during the Great Jewish Rebellion against Rome. Its final destruction, in the year 70, was more than the loss of a building. It was a deep spiritual wound, an inner exile from which Jewish history has yet to fully return. Today, all that remains of that temple is the Western Wall, a silent witness to countless prayers and unshakable hopes. The rest was erased, as if the world sought to obliterate the traces of the sacred. But memory endures, not only in archaeology or scripture, but in the soul of those who, upon hearing the name Jerusalem, still feel that a heart continues to beat within those stones. The Temple of Jerusalem was not just a place. It was an idea, a symbol of the meeting between the divine and the human, a space where heaven brushed the earth, where history was written with incense and tears. For Jesus, as for so many, it was both a starting point and a mirror. In its grandeur, he saw the promise. In its corruption, the urgency for change. In its fall, the need for a new temple, not one made of stone, but of hearts capable of love. The figure of John the Baptist, prophet, rebel, or sect leader. In the burning margins of the Judean desert, among sun-scorched rocks and the ceaseless murmur of the wind over the dust, a voice rose that broke the silence of centuries. A rough, resonant, profoundly human voice, yet one that carried the echo of places older than time itself. It was the voice of John, son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, known for generations as the Baptist. His figure stands at the threshold of Jesus' story like a column of fire, intense, unavoidable, and unpredictable. Who really was that man clothed in camel's hair, who fed on locusts and wild honey, and whose gaze seemed to pierce through flesh and reach the soul? The Gospels present him as the forerunner, the herald, the one who came to prepare the way. But to reduce John to a mere secondary figure in the messianic narrative would be a historical and spiritual injustice. John was, in himself, a force, a human phenomenon that emerged from the deepest part of a people's longing for justice. Justice not only in political terms but also in spiritual ones. His message was neither gentle nor accommodating. He offered no easy comforts or empty promises. It was a call to repentance, yes, but also to clarity, to see the world as it truly was, to stop pretending. John did not speak from the temple, nor from any seat of power. He sought no favor from the Sanhedrin nor from the Roman Empire. He spoke from the wilderness of the Jordan, from the open sky, and his words needed no ornament because they stood firmly on their rawness and the truth many did not wish to hear. "Brood of vipers," he once said to those who came to be baptized without any real intention of change. His was not the language of diplomacy or calculated leadership. It was the speech of a heart torn by the pain of his people. To some, John was an ancient-style prophet, one who spoke with the force of Elijah and the tenderness of Isaiah, mixing denunciation with promise. To others, he was a radical dissenter, an outsider who defied religious and political structures from the margins, backed only by his own conscience. And some have gone as far as to consider him a sectarian leader, akin to the Essenes of Qumran, those who also withdrew from society to await the coming kingdom. Yet John never claimed to be the founder of anything. He left behind no writings, built no institution. He left only a river, a gesture, and a word. The river, the Jordan, symbol of passage, of crossing, of transformation. The gesture, baptism, a symbolic immersion not merely to wash but to die and be reborn. And the word, that burning exhortation to prepare the way, not for himself, but for another who would come after him, greater, deeper, more silent even. In that sense, John was a bridge, a prophet whose greatness lay in stepping aside, in recognizing that his mission was to point, not to shine. His relationship with Jesus has been the subject of study, debate, and reflection for centuries. Some suggest that Jesus was initially a disciple of John, that he listened to him, followed him, and submitted to baptism not as a formality, but as part of an authentic inner awakening. And it's not hard to imagine Jesus approaching from Galilee, walking for hours, perhaps days, across dusty paths to reach the river, not just to meet a man, but to respond to a call. In that humble act of being baptized, there is more than submission. There is recognition, communion, and covenant. But there is also distance. Shortly after, their paths diverge. John continues preaching in the desert. Jesus begins his ministry in towns and villages. John continues to denounce the corruption of Herod. Jesus chooses to tell stories, heal, and draw close to those who suffer. And yet, there is an invisible continuity between them, the same flame in two distinct tones. John was the thunder, Jesus, the rain. One stirred the earth, the other nourished it. John's death is, in itself, a tragedy full of symbols. Imprisoned for denouncing the king's adultery, he ends up in a dark cell and is eventually beheaded at the whim of a young girl and the cowardice of a despot. His head, served on a platter, is a heartbreaking image of the price paid by those who refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. He did not die in battle nor of disease. He died for speaking the truth, and that makes him more than a martyr. It makes him a mirror. For anyone who chooses to live with integrity must sooner or later face their own prison, their own judgment, their own silver platter. Yet John's figure does not fade with his death. His legacy cuts through time with a raw and untamable force. He remains the image of radical commitment, a fidelity to an inner voice that does not compromise or yield. In a world where spirituality often becomes comfortable, decorative, or lukewarm, John is still a slap in the face. A sobering reminder that authentic faith always implies risk, disruption, and fire. He did not found churches, write gospels, or leave formulas or doctrines. And perhaps for that very reason, his message remains intact, pure, wild. Like the river, like the wind, like everything that cannot be caged. The miracles of Jesus, real healings or symbols. Throughout the gospel accounts, one of the most recurrent elements surrounding the figure of Jesus is his miracles. Stories of healings, exorcisms, the multiplication of food, walking upon stormy waters, and even resurrections intertwine with his teachings, creating the image of a man whose power exceeded comprehension. But beyond the immediate impact of those wondrous acts, beyond the astonishment of those who witnessed them, the most fascinating thing is what these miracles still awaken in those who read them today. Profound questions about the nature of the divine, the limits of the human, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of healing, both physical and spiritual. Jesus did not perform miracles as spectacles. He did not summon crowds to dazzle them with displays. Each of his extraordinary gestures seemed rooted in a concrete need, in a real pain, in an intimate encounter with another human being. The outcast leper, the blind man at the roadside, the woman who bled in silence, the paralytic lowered through a roof by his friends. All of them appear in the pages of the Gospels not as clinical cases, but as faces, as unique stories, full of anguish and hope. Jesus looks at them, touches them, calls them by name. There is no distance between the one who heals and the one who is healed. There is closeness, compassion, connection. The miracle, then, is not merely a suspension of natural laws. It is an act of love that restores dignity, that gives back to a person their place in the community, that breaks the isolation imposed by illness or stigma. In a society where physical affliction also meant religious and social exclusion, to be healed meant to be reintegrated. And perhaps that is the most subversive aspect of his miracles. Not that he defied biology, but that he defied the system, that he touched the untouchable, spoke with the invisible, brought back to the center those who had been pushed to the margins. The healings of Jesus also carry a profound symbolic component. Restoring sight to the blind is not only about recovering physical vision but about provoking a new way of seeing. Making a paralytic walk is an invitation to reclaim autonomy, to awaken from stillness, to return to one's story. Calming the storm is not merely about mastering the weather but about stilling the internal chaos. And when he calls Lazarus out of the tomb, he does so by name, as if each of us could hear that same call in the midst of our own small daily deaths. Over time, many have tried to interpret the miracles of Jesus allegorically. Some scholars argue that the gospel writers used these stories as symbols to convey deeper truths. The compassion of God, his nearness, the eruption of a kingdom that does not follow the logic of power but that of service. Others insist on their historical reality, on the concrete nature of these acts, defending the possibility that the divine can break into the natural world not to override it, but to elevate it. These positions, rather than contradict each other, can coexist. Because the miracles of Jesus are not just about what happened, they are about what they mean. And their meaning is not exhausted by a literal or metaphorical reading alone. They move within a broader dimension, where body and soul, visible and invisible, material and spiritual, intertwine. In the Gospels, healing is not only the restoration of a biological function but the repair of broken relationships. With oneself, with others, with God. In this sense, the miracles of Jesus cannot be understood apart from his message. They are not autonomous gestures or displays of power. They are signs. Signs that point beyond themselves. Each one is connected to the proclamation of the kingdom, that new order in which the last are first, in which mercy triumphs over the law, in which truth is spoken through parables and love is expressed in concrete actions. Miracles, then, are the visible embodiment of the good news. They are not propaganda, but prophecy. A key element in many of these stories is faith. Your faith has healed you, Jesus says again and again, not as a prerequisite for the miracle, but as an integral part of it. Faith is not a magic formula or a legal requirement. It is an interior openness, a readiness to receive the unexpected, to believe that reality can be transformed, and that faith is not always perfect. Sometimes it is fragile, hesitant, full of doubt. But it is enough, because the miracle does not demand perfection, only desire. It does not ask for certainty, but for seeking. The miracles of Jesus still challenge us today because they still happen. Perhaps not with the same drama as told in the texts, but in the way compassion transforms a life, in how a word spoken at the right moment can save someone from the brink, in how a hug, a listening ear, or a single gaze can be medicine for the soul. There are healings that go unseen but that nonetheless heal. There are resurrections that happen in silence, far from any spotlight, but that restore life to those who had already stopped hoping. To believe in miracles is not to believe in the impossible. It is to believe that love, when expressed radically, concretely, and freely, has a power that transcends all logic. It is to trust that tenderness can open paths where there was only stone. It is to know that even in the driest places, living water can spring forth. And that is not an escape from reality, but a deeper way of inhabiting it. The miracles of Jesus, whether real or symbolic, remain an invitation to see beyond appearances, to touch without fear, to speak with those who have been silenced, to believe that every wound can become a doorway, to discover that, in the midst of our fractures, the divine not only observes us, but draws near, touches us, and whispers, "Rise, your faith has healed you." The disciples, their life before and after Jesus, before becoming witnesses to miracles, preachers of the kingdom, and figures who would transcend the boundaries of time and the known world, the disciples of Jesus were simply men. They were not prophets, nor scholars, nor spiritual leaders. They were fishermen casting their nets into the Sea of Galilee at dawn, tax collectors despised by their own people, young men full of unanswered questions, older men with calloused hands and days marked by routine. They were ordinary. They were the fabric of everyday life. And it is precisely because of this that their transformation is so astonishing, so human, so deeply revealing. When Jesus called them, he did so with words as brief as they were decisive. "Follow me." He offered no promises of wealth, no guarantees of safety, no detailed itinerary. Just that radical invitation to leave the known behind and walk toward the unknown. And one by one they did, not because they fully understood who he was or what his destiny would be, but because something in his voice, in his presence, in his gaze unsettled their certainties. Because they sensed, perhaps without even knowing it, that following him was not about escaping their lives, but about entering more deeply into their true meaning. Simon, later called Peter, was impulsive, passionate, strong, and at times unstable. Andrew, his brother, quieter, was already seeking answers before meeting Jesus. James and John, sons of thunder, carried within them a fire that often bordered on pride. Matthew collected taxes for Rome, a symbol of betrayal to his own people. Thomas doubted. Philip asked questions. Bartholomew listened. Each one came with a history, a wound, a longing. The wonder is that Jesus did not choose them in spite of this, but precisely because of it. He did not call them because they were exemplary, but because they were real, because they could be a mirror for anyone. In them, the heart of his message is revealed. The kingdom is built with living stones, with people in process, with fragilities that are not obstacles, but the raw material of grace. During their time with Jesus, the disciples learned more with their feet than with their minds. They walked beside him down dusty roads, saw him stop for the blind, touch the leper, argue with the powerful, and weep for a friend. They heard him speak of seeds, of lost sheep, of narrow gates and hidden treasures. They shared his bread, his thirst, his fatigue, and with each step, their vision of the world began to change. But it was not an easy education. They often failed to understand his words. They argued among themselves about who was the greatest. They tried to keep children and women away. They slept when he asked them to keep watch. They denied him, abandoned him, betrayed him. They were human, all too human. And yet, he did not replace them. He did not condemn them. He kept calling them friends. Life with Jesus was, for them, a school of unlearning. They had to let go of expectations about a glorious Messiah, of a kingdom based on strength, in order to open themselves to the disconcerting logic of the cross. They discovered that power could be expressed in service, that authority could mean washing another's feet, that salvation did not come from above, but from the depths of shared pain. The death of Jesus shattered them. It was a wound to their certainties, an abyss in their convictions. Fear locked them in, grief paralyzed them. But it was in that emptiness that something new began to be born. Not through willpower, but through a profound experience of presence. The resurrection was not just an extraordinary event, it was a rediscovery of meaning. And from that moment on, their lives were never the same. Peter, the one who denied, became the rock. Thomas, the one who doubted, touched the wounds and declared his faith. John, the youngest, became the most contemplative. Matthew, the tax collector, recorded his testimony. Philip, the pragmatic, carried the message far and wide. And so each one, from within their own story, began to proclaim what they had lived, not as doctrine but as transformation. They no longer spoke of a teacher they had followed, but of a new life that now lived within them. The later story of the disciples intertwines with the growth of the early Christian movement. Some became martyrs, others missionaries, all of them sours. They walked harsh paths, faced misunderstanding, bore the weight of a truth they could no longer keep silent. And they did so without external grandeur, without temples, without political power. They did it with simple words, small gestures, and communities that shared bread and hope. The most moving thing about their lives is not that they were perfect, but that they were faithful. That despite their fears, they kept walking. That even with doubts, they kept believing. That from their fragility, they became witnesses. Their greatest miracle was not what they saw, but what they became. Because true conversion is not about changing ideas, but about being changed by love. Today, when we remember the disciples, we don't see them as statues on altars, but as companions on the path. They remind us that following is not a straight road, but one filled with stumbles and detours. That faith is not absolute certainty, but trust that renews itself. That it is not about having all the answers, but about living the questions deeply. That one does not need to be holy to begin, but that no one who is truly loved can remain the same. Their lives, before and after Jesus, are not two separate lives. They are a single story touched by light. A story of encounter, transformation, and fidelity. A story that remains open, like all true stories, waiting for someone else to say too, "Follow me." Mary Magdalene, disciple, wife, or symbol. Within the vast landscape of the gospel narrative, among names that repeat, voices that fade, and figures that blur with time, there is one presence that never ceases to burn quietly yet powerfully: Mary Magdalene. Her name has traversed centuries, wrapped in mystery, misinterpretation, controversy, and redemption. And yet, beneath the dust of dogma and speculation, there shines a story that resists erasure. To speak of Mary Magdalene is not simply to recall a woman from Jesus' inner circle. It is to descend into the depths of the human and the divine, into the space where fragility meets transformation, where shadow gives way to light. Her first mention in the Gospels is brief but striking. From her, we are told, Jesus cast out 7 demons. Whether this number is literal or symbolic, whether it speaks of physical, psychological, or social torment, we cannot be sure. But what is certain is that this woman, marked by suffering, by what is hidden and misunderstood, was set free. And in that liberation, her journey begins. Unlike others who vanish from the narrative after being healed, she does not leave. She stays. She follows. She serves. She walks with him. Mary of Magdala is not merely a silent witness. She is an active participant in the itinerant community that travels with Jesus. She is among the women who support him with their resources, who accompany him on his journeys, who listen, observe, and understand him through his gestures and his silences. And while many of the male disciples argue about status, cling to power, or flee in the hour of suffering, Mary remains. She is there at the foot of the cross when nearly everyone else has run. She watches as he is buried. And above all, she returns to the tomb, while it is still dark, to anoint his body. She is the one who weeps outside the empty grave. She is the one who hears her name called by the risen one. That moment, as brief as it is eternal, marks a rupture in the spiritual history of humanity. For Mary Magdalene is not merely the first to see the resurrected Christ. She is also the first to be sent. She receives from him the mission to announce the most radical message ever spoken: that death has been defeated, that hope has taken on flesh, that love is stronger than the grave. She becomes, therefore, the apostle to the apostles, the first herald, the one who carries light into the shadows. And yet, for centuries, her image was distorted, confused with other women, reduced to stereotypes, labeled a prostitute, a public sinner, a marginal figure. Why? Perhaps because her prominence was unsettling, because her closeness to Jesus disrupted the molds, because her spiritual authority continues, even now, to challenge structures that struggle with the voice of women who think, feel, and proclaim. Some apocryphal texts, such as the Gospel of Mary, depict her in an even more central role, not only as a witness, but as a teacher, a confidant, a bearer of hidden wisdom, even a rival voice to some of the male disciples. These early Christian writings, though excluded from the official canon, speak to the enduring impact she left upon the first communities. In these accounts, Mary is not a footnote. She is a center, a voice, a living memory. Over time, legends emerged, novels, esoteric theories, bold hypotheses that link her to Jesus in more intimate ways. Was she his wife, his spiritual partner, his confidant? These are questions that, while impossible to answer definitively, reflect something deeper. A human desire to understand the full dimension of Jesus' life, his ability to connect, to open himself, to love. But beyond all speculation, what remains essential is this: Mary Magdalene was a woman transformed by encounter, a woman who experienced liberation in her own body and soul, who discovered in Jesus not only a teacher, but a redeemer. And from that moment on, she could no longer turn back. Her life became testimony, path, and proclamation. She did not need pulpits or titles. Her voice rose from experience, from tears, from steadfastness. That steadfastness, that choice to remain when others fled, to seek when all seemed lost, makes her a symbol of an embodied, passionate, daring spirituality, a symbol of faith not based on knowledge, but on love, a symbol of so many women and men throughout history who have kept searching through the darkness, waiting for the voice that would speak their name, ready to run and tell the world what they had seen with their eyes and felt in their hearts. Mary Magdalene is more than a disciple. She is a bridge between the earthly and the risen Jesus, between pain and hope, between abandonment and promise. She embodies, in her steps and her voice, the truth of a faith born in the body and ignited in the soul. Today, her name rises again, not as an echo of old errors, but as a call to recover what has been forgotten, to honor what was silenced, to look with new eyes at those who have been cast aside. Because in Mary Magdalene, we do not just see the story of one woman. We see the possibility for all of us to be transformed by love, to live our faith with our whole being, and to follow fearlessly the voice that one day will call us to by name and say, "Go and proclaim." The trial of Jesus. The night Jesus was arrested, Jerusalem slept under the invisible tension of a sacred festival. Thousands of pilgrims filled the city with a solemn atmosphere. Yet on the fringes of law and in the shadows of power, one of the most complex, dark, and controversial episodes in all biblical history began to unfold: his trial. A judicial process that, more than an act of justice, appeared as a choreography of intertwined interests, hidden fears, political decisions, and intentional silences. The trial of Jesus was not ordinary. It began at night, itself a violation of the Sanhedrin's regulations that prohibited capital trials after sunset. This single anomaly opens a crack in the narrative, echoing urgency and haste. Why hold it at night? Why summon witnesses hastily, without public audience, without guarantees? The answers are not explicit in the text but implied between the lines. whispers revealing fear of the people's reaction, the resonance of Jesus' words, and the power of his presence even in silence. The process begins at the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where a hurried council convened. There are no clear accusations, and testimonies do not align. They attempt to find a legal reason but cannot. Finally, he is interrogated about his identity. "Are you the Son of God?" In one of the most intense moments of the gospel narrative, Jesus responds unequivocally. He neither defends himself nor retreats. He assumes his words, even though they condemn him. From that moment, the trial becomes a rite of expulsion. It is no longer about verifying guilt but disposing of a problem. They hand him over to Roman authorities, shifting responsibility like transferring a dangerous burden, looking for someone else to bear the blood they do not wish to claim. Here appears a figure that has fascinated generations: Pontius Pilate. Pilate, prefect of Judea, was no stranger to the people. His rule had been marked by brutality, tensions with Jewish priests, and displays of force. However, the gospel narrative portrays him as hesitant, almost uncomfortable before Jesus. He interrogates, observes, listens silently. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asks. Jesus' response is again not defensive but reflective. "You say so." Pilate seems unable to find guilt in him. He sends Jesus to Herod, receives him back, proposes releasing him instead of a known criminal. Throughout, he seems to seek a way out without implicating himself. Yet simultaneously, he allows the machinery of death to proceed. He washes his hands, a universal symbol of indifference disguised as neutrality. That seemingly simple scene conceals brutal depth. Power unwilling to protect innocence, power consenting through omission. Was Pilate guilty? Was he merely a minor cog trapped in a larger machine? Or did he simply choose convenience over correctness? History provides no single answer. It leaves us with a doubtful face, a phrase written on a tablet above the cross, and a silence that condemns as loudly as any word. The Gospels themselves offer differing versions of the trial. Some emphasize religious authorities' responsibility. Others focus more on Pilate. Some depict it as a formal trial, others as legal improvisation. These differences do not diminish credibility but invite us to understand the complexity of events. That night's events were not merely a condemnation. It was a political, spiritual, and human drama where each participant reacted based on fear, faith, power, or silence. The true motivations of those condemning him are difficult to clearly trace. For some, Jesus was a blasphemer, someone challenging religious structures from within. For others, he was an agitator, a threat to stability under Roman occupation. For many, he was simply uncomfortable, not because of what he said but how he said it. His authority did not come from the temple but compassion. Because he spoke to the marginalized, touched the impure, challenged the system quietly yet profoundly. The trial of Jesus reveals something deeper as well. How structures, when threatened, can become blind, deaf, and mute to truth. How justice can become an instrument of death when disconnected from human dignity. And how, even amid unjust machinery, light can continue to shine. Because Jesus, during that nocturnal trial, did not defend himself. He asked for no mercy, did not manipulate. He remained. And in his remaining, he revealed something indestructible. Truth that needs no imposition, only existence. His silence was more eloquent than speeches. His composure stronger than any sword. His gaze sharper than the judgment condemning him. And his cross, ultimately, was not merely the outcome of an unjust process but the revelation of love that transcends death. The trial of Jesus, more than a historical episode, is a mirror, a place reflecting our own cowardice, complicity, and fear of acting when the moment requires. But it is also a promise. Even in the darkest night, when everything seems lost, there is unwavering faithfulness. This faithfulness requires no proof or argument, only a heart willing to maintain its gaze. The mystery of the Shroud of Turin. In the heart of Europe, carefully guarded within the stone walls of an ancient cathedral, lies a cloth that has defied science, history, and faith for centuries. It is not made of gold or marble, bears no precious gems or dazzling inscriptions. It is merely a linen cloth, long, slightly yellowed by time, with a faint image resting upon it like a shadow frozen in time. And yet, that piece of fabric has sparked one of the most intense controversies in Christian tradition. The Shroud of Turin, believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. The documented history of the shroud begins in the 14th century, when it appeared in the small town of Liray, France, in the possession of a knight named Geoffroy de Charny. No one explained clearly how it came into his hands or where it had originated. What is known is that, from that moment on, word began to spread that the image depicted a crucified man, bearing wounds, blood, and signs of torture that matched the gospel accounts of the Passion. The shroud was venerated but also questioned. The church at first was cautious. There were doubts, suspicions, concerns that it might be a forgery. Even so, the object survived wars, fires, and looting, being moved from city to city until it finally arrived in Turin, Italy, where it remains preserved under strict protection. What captures attention is not just its connection to Christian narrative but the image itself. It is not painted. There are no visible brushstrokes, no pigments, no signs of human artistry. The figure appears as a light burn, a surface oxidation of the fibers that does not penetrate the fabric. When examined, the form of a man lying on his back is visible, his arms crossed over his abdomen, his feet placed one over the other, and a serene face marked by violence. The wounds of a crucifixion are evident. Injuries to the wrists and feet, blood stains on the forehead, a gash on the side, marks on the back. There are signs of scourging, of a crown of thorns, of a spear piercing the body. The image does not shout or horrify, but it moves the observer with its silence and precision. During the 20th century, researchers and scientists set out to study the shroud using the most advanced tools of their time. In the year 1978, an international group known as STURP, composed of experts in physics, chemistry, photography, and forensic medicine, was granted access to the cloth for a comprehensive analysis. They examined it under infrared and ultraviolet light, used electron microscopes and spectroscopy, and created high-resolution photographic records. And the results surprised even the skeptics. The image was not made with paint or ink. No organic compounds were found to suggest an artistic technique. The figure exhibited three-dimensional properties. When processed digitally, it revealed volumes, contours, and depth that were impossible to replicate using conventional means. But perhaps the most baffling element was the blood analysis. The stains contained real human hemoglobin, positioned in a pattern consistent with the wounds of crucifixion. Additionally, pollen grains were found on the cloth, some of which exist only in the region of present-day Palestine and bloom during spring, precisely the season when the death of Jesus is traditionally commemorated. These findings seem to support the cloth's authenticity. However, in the year 1988, a new test, this time using radiocarbon dating, appeared to cast everything into doubt. 3 different laboratories concluded that the fabric had been created sometime between the years 1260 and 1390, placing it squarely in the medieval period. This conclusion caused an immediate uproar. For many, it was final proof that the shroud could not possibly be the burial cloth of Jesus. But not everyone accepted that verdict. Critics quickly pointed out that the sample taken for the carbon dating test came from a corner of the cloth that had been visibly repaired after a fire in the year 1532. They argued that the threads used in the restoration could have contaminated the sample and altered the results. Moreover, over the centuries, the shroud had been handled frequently, exposed to candle smoke, and touched by countless hands, any of which could have influenced the dating process. Subsequent studies supported this hypothesis. Some experts suggested that the original fabric was significantly older than the portion tested. Others emphasized that no known process, neither ancient nor modern, could fully explain the image's formation. One of the strangest features is that the image becomes more visible at a distance, as if it were a photographic negative. Up close, the markings are faint, scattered, almost invisible. But when viewed as a whole, the figure emerges clearly, with a definition that seems less like a work of art and more like the imprint of a moment beyond time. Was it then a miracle? A supernatural event at the exact instant of death, as if some unknown energy had scorched the cloth with the final breath of a man on the cross? Or was it a masterfully crafted artifact, so perfect in its design that it continues to confound our instruments and our understanding? No one knows for certain, and perhaps that is the heart of the mystery. The shroud does not demand belief, nor does it force denial. It simply exists, like a mirror reflecting back our own questions, our hopes, our most intimate doubts. Beyond the dates, the tests, and the scientific debates, there is a deeply human dimension to the Shroud of Turin. To gaze upon the image is not merely to look at a face. It is to confront a sorrow contained in silence, a narrative of suffering and surrender. It speaks not only to the believer but to anyone who has ever contemplated pain, sacrifice, and the fragile beauty of life itself. Whether authentic or not, the shroud has touched the hearts of millions. It has ignited imagination, inspired art, and united believers and skeptics alike in contemplative stillness. And perhaps this is what makes it truly extraordinary, that a simple piece of cloth, bearing an image barely visible, continues to speak without words, crossing centuries with the same open-ended question, never imposing, never shouting, never needing to prove anything. Just being, just waiting, just enduring. The crucifixion. Among all the forms of execution practiced in antiquity, few were as cruel, as public, and as profoundly symbolic as crucifixion. It was not merely a method of ending a life, it was a declaration of power, a visible warning, a display of suffering turned into a political spectacle. The Roman Empire reserved it for rebellious slaves, enemies of the state, foreigners without rights, those who were deemed unworthy even of a quick death. It was not just punishment. It was systematic humiliation, a slow and painful process that stripped the individual of all dignity while their body hung between sky and earth, exposed before the indifferent gaze of soldiers, passers-by, and the authorities. When one says that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, it is not a casual historical note. It is a statement charged with meaning, a deliberate narrative choice that transforms history into symbol, pain into language, and execution into myth. Roman crucifixion did not follow a rigid protocol, but certain elements were common. The process often began with scourging, a preliminary torture that was not just formality but an essential part of the ordeal. The condemned person would be tied to a post and whipped with leather lashes embedded with bone or metal. Skin would tear, blood would spill, and the body would be left severely weakened, sometimes on the edge of collapse even before the execution itself. Then came the journey to the place of execution. In many cases, the condemned had to carry the horizontal beam of the cross through the streets, amid insults, stones, and looks of contempt. This path was not incidental, it was part of the punishment. The body was not the only target. The name, the memory, and the dignity of the individual were to be crushed as well. Upon arriving at the execution site, the victim's wrists or hands and feet were nailed or tied to the cross. The type of cross varied. Some were shaped like a T, others like the traditional Christian cross, and others were simple vertical stakes. The goal in all cases was to suspend the person in a way that prolonged the agony, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until asphyxiation, exhaustion, fever, or blood loss finally caused death. In the case of Jesus, the Gospels placed the crucifixion just outside the walls of Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. It happened during the Jewish festival of Passover, a sacred time of remembrance and liberation. That timing is not accidental. The narrative blends history with symbol and transforms the death of a man into an act filled with spiritual resonance. The cross is not merely an instrument of torture. It becomes a turning point in time, a crossroads where betrayal, suffering, and mystery converge. It is both a political execution and the seed of a transformation that reshapes how generations would view sacrifice and love. The texts say that, at the moment of Jesus' death, darkness fell over the land and the earth trembled. For centuries, scholars and believers alike have debated whether these were real phenomena or symbolic elements added to the narrative to emphasize the cosmic significance of the event. A solar eclipse cannot occur during Passover because it falls on the full moon, and an eclipse requires a new moon. However, There are historical accounts of unusual weather in the region at that time: sandstorms that darken the skies, earthquakes in the area near the Dead Sea. Whether literal or literary, the point of these elements is clear. Nature itself reacts to the suffering of the innocent. The heavens respond. The world is shaken. And here is where history gives way to symbol. The cross, intended to be the most degrading of punishments, becomes the central emblem of a religion that preaches hope, redemption, and love. The blood-stained wood, which by all logic should have been forgotten, is remembered, revered, and recreated endlessly in paintings, sculptures, churches, and songs. How can an execution tool become a symbol of life? It is a paradox that only makes sense when we see the crucifixion not as the end of the story, but as the threshold to something more. That transformation gives the cross its unexpected power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to reveal, to awaken, to redeem. Over time, many elements were added to the original gospel accounts. In the earliest Christian writings, descriptions of the physical torment are relatively restrained. It was in later centuries, especially through the mystical traditions of the Middle Ages and the rise of sacred art, that the suffering was emphasized and elaborated upon. The cross became more than a sign, it became a scene. The body of Christ was depicted with increasing graphic intensity. The nails, the thorns, the blood, the lowered head, the closed eyes. Each detail invited contemplation, drawing the faithful not as spectators, but as participants in the mystery of the Passion. Even the instruments of Jesus' suffering became objects of devotion. The crown of thorns, the nails, the spear, the sign above his head. Relics emerged. Splinters believed to be from the original cross, pieces of the tunic, preserved drops of blood. Whether authentic or not, these objects helped construct a powerful emotional and spiritual imagery, making the crucifixion not just a historical moment, but a continuing presence in the soul of Christian tradition. Thus, the cross ceased to be merely wood and iron. It became a summary of the human condition. Abandonment, injustice, physical agony, but also forgiveness, surrender, and compassion. Its symbolic force lies in the paradox it contains. Though it was a tool of death, it carries a promise of transformation. And that is what has kept the image of the cross alive in human consciousness for over 2,000 years. In this way, a public execution carried out under Roman authority became one of the central meditations of spirituality, ethics, and art. What began as a political warning ended as a message that transcends empires, languages, and centuries. The cross, in its silence of wood and nails, continues to speak, and it does so not with violence, but with a stillness that pierces. It reminds us not only of how a man died, but of how a death, contemplated with the eyes of the soul, can open a new path. The theft of Jesus' body. On Sunday morning, when the women arrived at the tomb, they found it empty. That simple fact, told with subtle variations across the Gospels, marks the beginning of one of the most enduring and provocative mysteries in the history of religious thought. The body of Jesus was no longer there. The stone had been rolled away. The linen cloths were left behind, but the body itself had vanished. And from that absence emerged a network of interpretations, testimonies, visions, doubts, legends, and theories that continue to nourish both faith and skepticism 2,000 years later. One of the earliest rumors, already recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, claimed that the disciples had stolen the body during the night while the guards slept, that it had all been a deception, that the empty tomb was not a sign of resurrection, but of conspiracy. From that moment on, the idea of a theft has taken on many forms, some pious, some provocative. Some versions point to Jesus' own followers, others to his enemies, and still others to unnamed third parties acting for unknown reasons, perhaps to fabricate a prophetic narrative that would have otherwise died with him. Certain interpretations suggest that the supposed theft may not have been political or religious at all, but ritual in nature. These ideas, more speculative and often rooted in esoteric traditions, propose that the body was removed as part of a symbolic act, perhaps linked to hidden burial customs, secret sects, or the transfer of spiritual authority. There is little historical evidence to support such claims, but the very idea adds another layer to the mystery. In the ancient world, especially in Gnostic traditions, the body of a sage was not just flesh, but a vessel of power. Its disappearance could signify transformation, not desecration. Another widely discussed hypothesis is the so-called swoon theory. According to this view, Jesus did not actually die on the cross but fell unconscious due to the trauma. He was taken down, wrapped hastily in linen and placed in the tomb just before the Sabbath began, with no opportunity for a detailed medical confirmation of death. Inside the cool, dark tomb, the theory goes he revived. Weakened but alive, he somehow escaped or was aided by someone who helped him flee in secret. While this theory has been promoted by various thinkers since the 18th century, it clashes with several core elements of the gospel narratives. The Roman method of execution was thorough and brutal. The spear that pierced his side would have been fatal. The blood loss was immense. And, above all, the image of the risen Jesus in later appearances does not match that of a man barely surviving a near-death trauma, but one glorified and transformed. What is striking is that, in the ancient world, no one seems to have seriously contested the fact of the empty tomb. Neither Jesus' followers nor his critics denied that his body was gone. The debate centered not on whether the tomb was empty, but on why. And here the contradictions arise. The Gospel of Mark mentions a young man announcing to the women that Jesus has risen. Matthew speaks of an earthquake, a radiant angel, and guards struck with fear. Luke describes two figures who interpret the event as fulfillment of Scripture. John tells of Mary Magdalene's confusion, her tears, and her encounter with a man she first believes to be the gardener. These accounts differ not in essence but in detail, tone, and perspective. Far from diminishing their meaning, this diversity gives the accounts texture and humanity. They are not clinical reports. They are emotional impressions from a moment that tore through ordinary comprehension. They are the language of shock and awe, filtered through memory and belief. Yet even amid the confusion, one fact remains. The body is missing. And without a body, there is no physical proof. That is why early Christianity did not rest its faith solely on the emptiness of the tomb, but on the presence of Jesus himself in post-resurrection appearances. If the body was no longer there, the question became, where was it now? And for the first followers, that answer was clear. Jesus was not gone. He was with them again, in a new form, no longer bound by the limitations of his previous life. The body that had suffered was now glorified. The stories do not speak merely of visions, but of touch, of shared meals, of wounds that could be seen and felt. That is why the physical body matters so deeply to the Christian faith. Because at the heart of that faith is not just an idea, but an event, a transformation of flesh and blood into something eternal. Without that transformation, the resurrection is a metaphor. With it, it becomes a revolution. This is why the early church defended the physical resurrection with such intensity. Gnostic sects, which saw the body as a prison of the soul, offered versions in which Jesus only appeared to suffer, or in which his spirit escaped while his body was left behind. But for the emerging orthodoxy, such views were unacceptable. The body was not an illusion, not disposable, it was essential. Without a body, there is no suffering. Without suffering, no sacrifice. And without sacrifice, no redemption. Thus, the mystery of the missing body becomes the cornerstone of the Christian story. Its absence is not a gap to be explained away. It is the opening through which light floods in. The fact that Jesus' body was never found is not an oversight, but the invitation to faith. What happened in that sealed tomb? What did the women truly see in that strange, quiet moment? What did the disciples understand when they saw the linen folded neatly, and nothing else? Perhaps there is no single, definitive answer. Perhaps the power of the story lies precisely in its ambiguity, in the tension between history and symbol, between evidence and mystery. What is clear is that, from that day forward, the body of Jesus, absent, yet present, became the heart of a spiritual revolution. Not because it was stolen or hidden, but because, as the believers declared, it was changed. Not because it vanished into darkness, but because it emerged transformed into light. And that transformation, incomprehensible to reason but luminous to faith, continues to echo in every soul that has ever stood before an empty tomb and wondered what it means to hope in the face of absence. The Gospel of Judas, a betrayal that wasn't. For centuries, the name of Judas Iscariot has been cloaked in darkness, synonymous with betrayal, treachery, and the ultimate failure of loyalty. He is the disciple who broke the circle, the friend who sold out his master, the man whose kiss sealed a death sentence. Judas, in the collective Christian imagination, is the fracture at the heart of the Last Supper, the shadow amid the light, the embodiment of what it means to fall. And yet, buried beneath centuries of condemnation and silence, there exists another version of his story, a gospel long forgotten, rejected, nearly destroyed, a text that presents Judas not as traitor, but as the one who truly understood Jesus. The so-called Gospel of Judas was known to early Christians, though swiftly branded heretical. Believed lost for over a millennium, a copy written in Coptic surfaced in the 1970s, buried in the sands of Egypt. Its publication in 2006 stirred both academic and spiritual circles, not because it offered hard historical proof, but because it radically reshaped the most iconic betrayal narrative in Western religion. The moment in Gethsemane when loyalty and fate collided. This gospel, rooted in Gnostic tradition, does not recount Jesus' life in the familiar patterns of miracles, parables, and passion. It is not a linear biography, but a dialogue, complex, symbolic, esoteric. It focuses almost entirely on the conversations between Jesus and Judas. And within those intimate, mysterious exchanges, Judas emerges not as the disciple who misunderstood, but as the one who truly saw. The one to whom Jesus entrusted his deepest truths. The one chosen not in spite of his betrayal but because of it. According to this text, Judas's act was not betrayal, it was obedience. Jesus tells him he will exceed all the other disciples, that he will sacrifice the human body of the Son of Man so that the divine self might be freed. In this version, the handing over of Jesus is not a failure, but a fulfillment. Judas is not deceived, he is enlightened. He does not act out of greed, but out of courage. In doing what no other dared, he becomes not the villain of the story, but its hidden hero. The worldview of this gospel is unmistakably Gnostic. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world is often seen as the creation of a flawed, lesser deity, a realm of ignorance and limitation. Salvation does not come through sacrifice and resurrection in the flesh, but through awakening, through knowledge, gnosis, of the divine spark within. Jesus, in this gospel, is not a redeemer through suffering, but a revealer of hidden truths. And Judas is the only one capable of grasping the radical nature of this revelation. The crucifixion is no longer a tragic ending, but a necessary departure. A liberation, not a punishment. It is not difficult to understand why this perspective was excluded from the canon. If Judas is not the betrayer, the narrative balance is shattered. The clear line between light and darkness blurs. The moral clarity of the gospel story gives way to a more complex, less manageable truth. And perhaps most threatening of all, this version questions the spiritual maturity of the remaining disciples. In the Gospel of Judas, they are portrayed as confused, clinging to outdated rituals, unable to comprehend the true nature of Jesus' mission. Only Judas hears. Only Judas understands. For the early church, consolidating belief, defining doctrine, and preserving unity, ambiguity was dangerous. Faith needed structure, clarity, authority. It needed martyrs and saints, but also examples of failure to warn and define the boundaries of truth. Judas, therefore, had to remain condemned, as Peter remained foundational. The institution could not afford to tolerate a text that undermined the narrative architecture it was building. And so the Gospel of Judas was declared heresy and disappeared for over 1,000 years into silence. Its rediscovery does not rewrite the Bible. It does not demand the removal of the canonical Gospels or the replacement of Christian teaching. But it invites reflection. It reminds us that Christianity's early centuries were not monolithic, but filled with diversity, conflict, and competing visions. Many voices were silenced not necessarily because they were false, but because they were inconvenient, subversive, unsettling. Among those voices is one that dared to see Judas not as damned, but as divinely chosen. Not as the one who failed Jesus, but as the only one willing to carry out the final, terrible necessity. If Judas did not betray, then what changes? Everything. The way we understand sacrifice, obedience, divine will, and human freedom. The Last Supper becomes not the moment of rupture, but the moment of trust. The kiss in the garden becomes not a sign of betrayal, but of acceptance. Judas becomes not a symbol of corruption, but of mystery, of the path walked alone, misunderstood and unrewarded. He becomes the archetype of the one who obeys beyond understanding, who embraces a role no one else would bear. This is not an easy interpretation. It is not meant to comfort or excuse. It does not romanticize Judas, nor erase the pain of what followed. But it asks us to look deeper, to consider that the line between good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, might not be as clear as we've been taught. That within each sacred story lies a tension that cannot be resolved with certainty, but must be lived with humility. The Gospel of Judas may never be accepted as scripture. Its ideas may remain on the fringe, but its existence challenges us to mature in our reading of sacred texts. It asks us to allow complexity, to embrace mystery, to listen to voices once cast out. It reveals how the stories we tell, and the ones we choose not to tell, shape our understanding of faith, justice, and redemption. Perhaps we will never know how much of this gospel reflects historical memory and how much is theological imagination. But its value may lie elsewhere, not in what it says about the past, but in what it makes us ask about the present. About our need to see villains and heroes, about our comfort with clear-cut morality, about our willingness to revisit what we think we know, and perhaps most profoundly, about what it means to love, to obey, and to be misunderstood in the service of something greater than oneself. The resurrection. On the third day, something shifted. There was no thunderclap in the sky, no blinding light from the clouds, no divine trumpet echoing across the hills. No crowds gathered to witness the precise moment when death was undone. It happened in silence, in the early hours of morning, when the earth still lay half asleep and hope felt like a memory too distant to reclaim. The resurrection of Jesus did not arrive like a parade. It crept into the world like a whisper, a soft tremor in the fabric of time. No one saw it occur. What they saw was what remained. An open tomb, discarded linen, and the sudden, inexplicable absence of a body. To say that Jesus rose from the dead is not the same as saying he returned to life. It is not a statement about resuscitation or a mere interruption of the natural order. The resurrection, in the understanding of those who first experienced it, was not a return, it was a transformation. Jesus did not come back, he went beyond. The one who had died was now alive in a way that defied explanation. He bore the wounds of the crucifixion, yet his body was different, recognizable, yes, but not always immediately so. He appeared and disappeared, passed through doors, ate with his friends, walked along roads, and vanished just as mysteriously. It was him, and yet, something had changed forever. The Gospels speak of appearances, moments that seem suspended between the physical and the mystical. Mary Magdalene mistakes him for the gardener. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk miles with him before their eyes are opened. Thomas demands proof and receives it, placing his fingers into wounds that were real and yet no longer bleeding. These are not polished theological constructs. They are stories steeped in awe and disorientation. The risen Jesus does not announce himself with grandeur. He arrives quietly, often in the midst of fear, grief, or confusion. The resurrection was not staged for spectacle. It was entrusted to the brokenhearted. And the accounts do not align neatly. The Gospels vary in detail, in sequence, even in emphasis. Mark ends abruptly with women fleeing in fear. Matthew offers a dramatic angel and a radiant encounter. Luke tells of teaching and calm clarity, while John lingers in intimate gestures and names spoken in quiet recognition. These variations do not weaken the story. They reveal its depth. They are windows opened onto a mystery too vast to fit into one telling. The resurrection cannot be diagrammed or dissected. It resists finality. It speaks in echoes, glimmers, in the stammered joy of those who saw and could never forget. What then did they see? Was it a vision? Was it real? Was it flesh or light or something in between? The early followers of Jesus were clear about one thing. He was alive. Not metaphorically, not as a beautiful memory, not in their hearts alone. He was truly, physically, gloriously alive. But this life was unlike any life they had known. It transcended biology and defied expectation. This was not a return to the old life but the birth of something utterly new. And in that newness was the beginning of everything. They did not expect it. They had fled, denied, wept, locked their doors. They were not poised for triumph. They were drowning in loss. And yet, it was to them that the risen one came. Not to Pilate, not to the high priests, not to the powerful, but to those whose faith had faltered, to the ones who had run away. The resurrection is, among other things, a story of undeserved grace. The first to hear the good news were not the boldest, but the broken, not the faithful but the failed. And in that grace lies the strength of the story. It does not demand belief, it invites transformation. It does not require certainty, it opens a path. And for those early witnesses, the path led from fear to courage, from silence to proclamation, from hiding to martyrdom. Something had happened, something they could not explain, and yet something they could not deny. The tomb was empty. He was not there, but he was with them. The resurrection gave meaning to the crucifixion. Without it, the cross is simply another tragedy, a symbol of injustice and failure. With it, the cross becomes a doorway. Suffering is not erased, but transfigured. The body that had been broken now blesses bread again. The voice that had cried out in anguish now speaks peace. And the presence that had been extinguished now burns in the hearts of those who believed they had lost everything. But even so, the resurrection is not a triumphal anthem. It is also silence, absence, wonder. There is no blueprint for how it unfolds. It is experienced in the quiet garden, in the long walk, in the shared meal, in the breath of recognition. It does not impose, it whispers. It does not shout, it calls by name. It is the slow dawning that maybe, just maybe, life is stronger than death. That maybe love does not end with a grave. And it matters that Jesus rose not as a ghost, not as a metaphor, but with a body marked by wounds, a body that remembers suffering, a body that still breaks bread. In that body is a promise that what is mortal is not discarded, that the material is not the enemy of the spiritual, that redemption touches everything. Flesh, history, memory, all can be healed, all can rise. This is why the early Christians risked their lives to share the news. Not for an idea, but for a reality that had changed them. Not for a legend, but for a living presence that had met them in their fear and breathed peace. They did not die for a dream. They lived for a truth they could not silence. The resurrection was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new world. And still, there is a silence around it. A reverence. The resurrection is not something to prove, but something to receive. It cannot be reduced to doctrine or logic. It must be encountered, again and again, in every moment where light finds its way through the cracks of despair, in every act of forgiveness, in every stubborn hope, in every dawn that follows the darkest night. Perhaps that is what makes the resurrection live on, not as a relic of the past, but as a breath in the present. Because if he lives, then love lives. And if love lives, then we can begin again. The Apostle Paul, the true founder of Christianity? When we speak of the origins of Christianity, one figure inevitably rises from the shadows of history, not as one of the original 12, not as a fisherman called on the shore, not as a witness to the parables or the cross, but as the voice that would shape and carry the message farther than anyone before him. Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Apostle Paul, began not as a believer but as a fierce persecutor, a defender of tradition, a man zealous for the law. And yet, it is this man who, after a single shattering encounter, became the movement's most tireless advocate, most prolific writer, and perhaps its most radical interpreter. Paul never met Jesus during his earthly ministry. He was not there when the loaves were broken or when the blind saw. He did not walk the dusty roads of Galilee or stand in the garden that last night. And yet, it is Paul who would speak of Christ with the urgency of one who had looked into the center of truth. His letters, the earliest Christian documents we possess, were not written in calm reflection, but in fire, born from vision, carved by tension, driven by urgency. They are the voice of a man transformed. His conversion, if it can be called that, was not a gentle change of mind. It was a rupture, a collapse and rebuilding of identity. On the road to Damascus, Saul fell to the ground and rose as someone new. Not by persuasion, not by doctrine, but by encounter. A light, a voice, a presence. What happened there remains cloaked in mystery, but its effects were irreversible. The man who once hunted believers became the one who would carry their message across continents. And he did not merely preach, he built. He founded communities, crossed borders, bridged cultures. He took a Jewish Messiah and proclaimed him to the Gentiles. He translated the message into Greek, into philosophy, into terms a Roman citizen or Greek thinker could grasp. In doing so, he did not betray the original message. He reinterpreted it for the world beyond Judea. He shifted the movement from a local renewal to a global revolution. But that revolution came at a cost. Paul's vision was not universally welcomed. Among the early leaders, those who had walked with Jesus, there was unease. Peter, the one given the keys, and James, the brother of the Lord, stood closer to Jewish tradition. They emphasized continuity with the law, identity through heritage. Paul, in contrast, declared, "In Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male or female." Such statements were not only theological, they were political, social, even explosive. The letters tell the story of these tensions. In Galatians, Paul recounts confronting Peter to his face for hypocrisy. He accuses others of compromising the gospel by insisting on circumcision, dietary laws, or ethnic boundaries. For Paul, the resurrection of Christ marked not just a new chapter, it was the end of the old order. The law was fulfilled, and something entirely new had begun. Faith, not lineage. Spirit, not ritual. Inclusion, not boundary. And yet, Paul was not always consistent. In some letters, he speaks of radical freedom, of liberation from all law. In others, he offers moral instructions, affirms certain customs, and even seems to restrict roles within the community. He is a complex figure, visionary and pastor, prophet and pragmatist. He writes with fire and with care. He is deeply aware of his own limitations and never hesitates to speak of his weakness. It is that vulnerability, that lack of polish, that makes his voice still resonate today. Some have gone so far as to suggest that Paul, not Jesus, was the true founder of Christianity. That without Paul, Jesus might have remained a revered rabbi, a prophetic figure lost among others in the long arc of Jewish history. There is a truth in this claim. Paul did more than anyone to spread the message, to organize the church, to articulate its theology. He was, in a sense, the architect of the faith as it came to be known. But such a statement also misses something essential. Paul never claimed to replace Jesus. On the contrary, he saw himself as a servant, an apostle called late, as one untimely born. He writes not of himself, but always of Christ crucified and risen. For Paul, the cross was not a defeat. It was the place where divine love took on human pain. The resurrection was not a metaphor, it was a new creation, and it began in him. His theology is not cold doctrine. It is personal, it is breathed out of suffering, out of awe, out of relentless hope. And perhaps that is what makes Paul so foundational. Not that he founded a religion, but that he embodied its transformation. His life became a map of what he preached. He who once held the coats of those who stoned believers would himself be beaten, imprisoned, ultimately executed for the same name. His words were not mere teaching, they were testimony. His letters are not philosophical essays, they are wounds turned into witness. He argued with apostles, clashed with communities, corrected and was corrected. He never claimed perfection, but he never ceased to proclaim that something had happened. Something real, something that changed everything. That in Christ, the old had passed away, and all things were being made new. Without Paul, would there be Christianity as we know it? Perhaps not. But without Christ, there would be no Paul. And that, perhaps, is the mystery. That a man who never met Jesus in the flesh came to know him more intimately than most. That through him, the message was carried into the heart of an empire, and from there into the heart of the world. Even now, his words ring with paradox and poetry, struggle and clarity. He is loved and misunderstood, honored and contested. But he remains, unmistakably, a voice that shaped a faith, not by erasing its roots, but by daring to imagine its future. The Apostle Paul, the true founder of Christianity? When we speak of the origins of Christianity, one figure inevitably rises from the shadows of history, not as one of the original 12, not as a fisherman called on the shore, not as a witness to the parables or the cross, but as the voice that would shape and carry the message farther than anyone before him. Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Apostle Paul, began not as a believer but as a fierce persecutor, a defender of tradition, a man zealous for the law. And yet, it is this man who, after a single shattering encounter, became the movement's most tireless advocate, most prolific writer, and perhaps its most radical interpreter. Paul never met Jesus during his earthly ministry. He was not there when the loaves were broken or when the blind saw. He did not walk the dusty roads of Galilee or stand in the garden that last night. And yet, it is Paul who would speak of Christ with the urgency of one who had looked into the center of truth. His letters, the earliest Christian documents we possess, were not written in calm reflection, but in fire, born from vision, carved by tension, driven by urgency. They are the voice of a man transformed. His conversion, if it can be called that, was not a gentle change of mind. It was a rupture, a collapse and rebuilding of identity. On the road to Damascus, Saul fell to the ground and rose as someone new. Not by persuasion, not by doctrine, but by encounter. A light, a voice, a presence. What happened there remains cloaked in mystery, but its effects were irreversible. The man who once hunted believers became the one who would carry their message across continents. And he did not merely preach, he built. He founded communities, crossed borders, bridged cultures. He took a Jewish Messiah and proclaimed him to the Gentiles. He translated the message into Greek, into philosophy, into terms a Roman citizen or Greek thinker could grasp. In doing so, he did not betray the original message. He reinterpreted it for the world beyond Judea. He shifted the movement from a local renewal to a global revolution. But that revolution came at a cost. Paul's vision was not universally welcomed. Among the early leaders, those who had walked with Jesus, there was unease. Peter, the one given the keys, and James, the brother of the Lord, stood closer to Jewish tradition. They emphasized continuity with the law, identity through heritage. Paul, in contrast, declared, "In Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no male or female." Such statements were not only theological, they were political, social, even explosive. The letters tell the story of these tensions. In Galatians, Paul recounts confronting Peter to his face for hypocrisy. He accuses others of compromising the gospel by insisting on circumcision, dietary laws, or ethnic boundaries. For Paul, the resurrection of Christ marked not just a new chapter, it was the end of the old order. The law was fulfilled, and something entirely new had begun. Faith, not lineage. Spirit, not ritual. Inclusion, not boundary. And yet, Paul was not always consistent. In some letters, he speaks of radical freedom, of liberation from all law. In others, he offers moral instructions, affirms certain customs, and even seems to restrict roles within the community. He is a complex figure, visionary and pastor, prophet and pragmatist. He writes with fire and with care. He is deeply aware of his own limitations and never hesitates to speak of his weakness. It is that vulnerability, that lack of polish, that makes his voice still resonate today. Some have gone so far as to suggest that Paul, not Jesus, was the true founder of Christianity. That without Paul, Jesus might have remained a revered rabbi, a prophetic figure lost among others in the long arc of Jewish history. There is a truth in this claim. Paul did more than anyone to spread the message, to organize the church, to articulate its theology. He was, in a sense, the architect of the faith as it came to be known. But such a statement also misses something essential. Paul never claimed to replace Jesus. On the contrary, he saw himself as a servant, an apostle called late, as one untimely born. He writes not of himself, but always of Christ crucified and risen. For Paul, the cross was not a defeat. It was the place where divine love took on human pain. The resurrection was not a metaphor, it was a new creation, and it began in him. His theology is not cold doctrine. It is personal, it is breathed out of suffering, out of awe, out of relentless hope. And perhaps that is what makes Paul so foundational. Not that he founded a religion, but that he embodied its transformation. His life became a map of what he preached. He who once held the coats of those who stoned believers would himself be beaten, imprisoned, ultimately executed for the same name. His words were not mere teaching, they were testimony. His letters are not philosophical essays, they are wounds turned into witness. He argued with apostles, clashed with communities, corrected and was corrected. He never claimed perfection, but he never ceased to proclaim that something had happened. Something real, something that changed everything. That in Christ, the old had passed away, and all things were being made new. Without Paul, would there be Christianity as we know it? Perhaps not. But without Christ, there would be no Paul. And that, perhaps, is the mystery. That a man who never met Jesus in the flesh came to know him more intimately than most. That through him, the message was carried into the heart of an empire, and from there into the heart of the world. Even now, his words ring with paradox and poetry, struggle and clarity. He is loved and misunderstood, honored and contested. But he remains, unmistakably, a voice that shaped a faith, not by erasing its roots, but by daring to imagine its future. The Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the dry silence of the Judean desert, just west of the Dead Sea, there lies a landscape of stone, dust and shadows, windswept and seemingly barren. Yet beneath that stillness, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, the past whispered. And in 1947 it began to speak. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran marked one of the most extraordinary archaeological and spiritual revelations of the 20th century. Hundreds of scrolls, biblical, apocryphal, and sectarian, preserved in clay jars, stored away as if waiting for an age that might finally understand them. And with them emerged the story of a people, the Essenes, mysterious, devout, distant from the world. And ever since, a single question has hovered in the background. Did Jesus live among them? The Essenes are not mentioned by name in the New Testament. They were neither Pharisees nor Sadducees, the two groups frequently challenged by Jesus in the Gospels. But according to ancient historians like Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder, the Essenes formed a distinct community, one marked by strict discipline, ritual purity, and deep apocalyptic expectation. They withdrew from the corruption of the temple in Jerusalem and chose instead to live in isolated communal settlements, perhaps most famously at Qumran, where they followed a rigid code of conduct, awaited divine intervention, and practiced a form of spiritual separatism that saw the outside world as impure and doomed. Their beliefs and practices invite striking comparisons with certain teachings of Jesus. Like the Essenes, Jesus spoke of the coming of God's kingdom, and like them, he challenged the religious elite of his time. The Essenes valued humility, spiritual purity, and a community free from personal wealth, principles echoed in Jesus' calls to forsake possessions, serve one another, and live with integrity. The dualism present in Essene texts, the opposition between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, resonates with the Gospel of John, where Jesus speaks of being the light in a world of shadow. But there are also sharp differences. Where the Essenes withdrew, Jesus engaged. Where they avoided the impure, he healed them. He ate with tax collectors, touched lepers, forgave adulterers. His holiness was not one of separation, but of radical closeness. The scrolls themselves, discovered in a series of caves near Qumran between 1947 and 1956, number over 800 documents, many in fragments, written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Among them are some of the earliest known copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, alongside sectarian writings unique to the Essene community. One of the most compelling is the Community Rule, a text describing the regulations of daily life in the sect. Initiation rites, shared meals, punishments for infractions, and spiritual hierarchy. Another is the War Scroll, a vivid apocalyptic vision of the final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. A cosmic drama rooted in divine justice and vengeance. Perhaps most enigmatic is the Habakkuk commentary, which speaks of a teacher of righteousness, a spiritual leader persecuted by a wicked priest and betrayed by a man of the lie. Scholars have speculated endlessly about these figures. Some see them as reflections of real historical leaders, others as prototypes for the messianic figure that would emerge in Jesus. There is no direct mention of Christ in the scrolls, and no textual link between Qumran and the Gospel narratives. But the spiritual climate they reveal, the fervent expectation, the yearning for purity, the belief in an imminent divine reckoning, is undeniably the same atmosphere that surrounded Jesus' ministry. The question that lingers is compelling, though unanswerable. Did Jesus know of the Essenes? Did he study with them? Did he reject their way, or perhaps borrow from it in his own radical way? The Gospels remain silent on this matter. But some have speculated that the so-called lost years of Jesus, those unaccounted for between his childhood and public ministry, could have included time spent with communities like Qumran. Whether this is history or hypothesis remains debated. But spiritually, the connections are suggestive. And then there is the matter of the scrolls themselves. Who hid them and why? The most accepted theory is that as Roman forces advanced during the First Jewish-Roman War, the Essenes of Qumran, sensing the impending destruction, carefully placed their sacred texts into jars and concealed them in caves surrounding their settlement. It was an act of preservation and defiance, a way to protect their wisdom from fire and sword, to pass on their voice even if they themselves perished. And perish they did. Qumran was destroyed, the community scattered or slaughtered, but the scrolls remained, sleeping in silence until a Bedouin shepherd cast a stone into a cave and heard the shatter of pottery and history alike. The significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is vast. They illuminate not only the world of the Essenes, but the larger religious and political ferment in which Jesus lived and preached. They show us that Second Temple Judaism was far from monolithic. It was vibrant, fractured, searching. There were sects and schisms, dreams and prophecies, debates over law, purity, priesthood, and messianic hope. Jesus' message did not emerge in a void. It was born in the storm. The scrolls give us context, not to diminish his uniqueness, but to better understand the soil from which he rose. Whether or not Jesus ever set foot in Qumran, the voices that echo from its caves remind us of how much he had in common with the hopes and fears of his time. His message was revolutionary but not isolated. It responded to a world longing for justice, for a new covenant, for divine closeness. The scrolls are not a secret gospel, but they are a mirror. And in that mirror, we glimpse the tremors of a world that stood on the brink of transformation. Today, as scholars still piece together these fragments, the scrolls continue to whisper across the centuries, not just about law and prophecy, but about the fragile, fierce faith of those who wrote, hid, and died believing their words mattered. They believed that in parchment and ink, in discipline and vision, God would one day be heard again. And perhaps they were right, because in their hidden caves, among dust and ruin, we find not only their voice, but an echo of one greater, one who also walked the desert, called for repentance, and spoke with the authority of heaven. The scrolls may not name him, but they lead us to the threshold of his world, and there, the silence begins to speak. The Apocalypse and the coded message of John. Written from exile in a time when empires roared and believers whispered, the Apocalypse of John, commonly known as the Book of Revelation, is not merely a prophecy of destruction. It is a symphony of images, a spiritual revolt wrapped in cosmic fire. It is a vision whispered in secrecy, a cry against injustice disguised as poetry, a desperate and radiant hymn composed from the edge of a crumbling world. Its language is not meant to be linear. It is veiled, coded, drenched in metaphor and steeped in resistance. Behind every beast, every trumpet, every sealed scroll, there lies not only a glimpse of the end, but a mirror held to the present. At first glance, Revelation may seem like a roadmap of coming doom. Wars, plagues, earthquakes, rivers turned to blood, stars falling from the sky. But many scholars and mystics throughout the centuries have seen beneath the surface, have read the text not only as a prediction of future cataclysms, but also as a veiled political critique of the Roman Empire. Written at a time when Christians faced growing persecution, it served as both a spiritual vision and a subversive document. The seven-headed beast rising from the sea was not an otherworldly monster. It was Rome, seated on 7 hills. The whore of Babylon, adorned in scarlet and gold, was not a symbolic sinner, but the imperial city itself, drunk on conquest and wealth. Babylon was a cipher, and the readers of the time knew how to decode it. This dual structure, prophecy and protest, gives Revelation its haunting power. To the faithful, it promised that evil would not prevail, that the Lamb once slain would reign, that justice, however delayed, would come like a flood. But to the watchful, it also offered something more immediate, a warning against complicity, a demand for spiritual resistance. It was not merely a text to be read. It was a call to endure, to remain faithful, to see through the glitter of empire and recognize its rot. And it did so not through sermons or logic, but through visions, searing, strange, unforgettable. Among the most notorious of these visions is the mention of the number of the beast, 666. It is perhaps the most famous number in the history of religion, feared, studied, and misinterpreted for generations. The text itself says it is the number of a man, and invites the wise to calculate it. Through a practice known as gematria, where letters have numerical values, many believe this was a hidden reference to Emperor Nero. His name, when written in Hebrew characters and added up, equaled the fateful number. If so, then this was no cryptic horror. It was a quiet thunderclap of rebellion, naming the oppressor without speaking his name. But the number also grew beyond its historical roots. Over the centuries, 666 became a symbol for evil in all its forms, political, spiritual, psychological. It was attached to institutions, ideologies, even everyday objects. It entered popular culture, mythology, and fear itself. Yet, in the book of Revelation, the number is not explained. It is presented as a mystery to be solved, a code to be cracked. And in this lies a deeper truth, that evil often hides behind symbols, behind systems, behind masks. It is rarely obvious. It must be discerned, not just seen but understood. The entire fabric of Revelation is woven with symbolism. The 4 horsemen, conquest, war, famine, and death, ride not only across the pages of Scripture but through every age of human history. The slain Lamb, who is at once victim and victor, stands at the heart of the vision, a paradox of power turned inside out. Angels sound trumpets, bowls of wrath are poured upon the earth, stars fall, and the earth shakes. But this is not a literal forecast. It is a sacred drama, a theological thunderstorm. Revelation speaks in the language of the soul's deep fears and eternal longings. It's not meant to tell us what will happen. It's meant to awaken us to what is already happening, because Revelation is not simply about the end of the world. It is about how to live in a world that feels like it is ending. It teaches vigilance in the face of corruption, perseverance in suffering, clarity in confusion. Each generation has looked into its pages and found their own reflection. A tyrant, a war, a plague, a hope. Revelation does not bind us to a single interpretation. It invites us into a space of vision, where symbols reveal more than facts, and where the heart is as much a reader as the mind. In this space, we must confront one uncomfortable truth. Revelation has often been used as a tool of fear. Throughout history, preachers and empires alike have wielded its terrifying images to control, to threaten, to dominate. The final judgment, the lake of fire, the sealed fate of sinners, all these have been emphasized to instill obedience through dread. And while the text certainly contains warnings, it also contains a promise. The New Jerusalem, where every tear is wiped away, where death is no more, where the Lamb shines as an eternal light. The danger lies in stopping at the terror and never reaching the hope. At its core, Revelation is not about predicting catastrophe. It is about proclaiming transformation. It tells us that what seems permanent is not, that empires fall, that injustice has an end, that light, however fragile, is never finally extinguished. It teaches us that salvation is not found in escape, but in faithfulness. That even in the face of monstrous powers, we are called to bear witness, not with weapons, but with endurance, with vision, with truth. The Apocalypse of John is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a book to be entered, wrestled with, and ultimately inhabited. It does not flatter. It does not comfort easily, but it does offer something deeper. A burning confidence that history is not senseless, that suffering is not final, that what is hidden will one day be revealed, and that love, wounded, crucified, resurrected, will have the last word. The early churches, the conflict between history and faith. When we imagine the early days of Christianity, it is tempting to envision a unified group, bound by shared hope and driven by a single spirit. A movement born in harmony, rooted in the teachings of Jesus, growing together as one. But the reality was more intricate, more human, more fragile. The early churches were not a monolithic structure but a constellation of scattered communities, diverse, experimental, sometimes in conflict. What held them together was not uniformity, but a common longing to understand what it meant to follow the one they called Lord, after his death, resurrection, and mysterious departure. And in that longing arose a tension as ancient as belief itself, the conflict between history and faith, between what happened and what was later understood to have happened, between memory and meaning. One of the earliest and most significant tensions was the division between Jewish Christians and converted pagans. The first followers of Jesus were all Jews. They did not see themselves as leaving Judaism, but as fulfilling it. They observed the Torah, went to the temple, celebrated the Jewish festivals. Jesus, for them, was the promised Messiah, not a break from their faith but its culmination. But as the message spread beyond Judea, especially through the missionary journeys of Paul of Tarsus, new questions emerged. Were Gentile converts required to be circumcised, to keep kosher, to live as Jews? The answers were not obvious. To many Jewish believers, welcoming Gentiles without the law seemed like abandoning the covenant. To many Gentile converts, Jewish customs felt foreign, even burdensome. The Council of Jerusalem, held around the middle of the 1st century, tried to settle these disputes with compromise, but tensions remained. Some communities clung to their Jewish roots. Others embraced a broader, more inclusive identity. In time, especially after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, the center of gravity shifted. Christianity distanced itself from its Jewish foundation, not without loss. A new religion was born, but a deep fracture had formed, one that would echo painfully across the centuries. Within these expanding communities, something else remarkable was happening. Women held leadership roles. Far from the later image of passive silence, the early church was filled with women who taught, prophesied, hosted worship, and led others in faith. In Paul's letters, we meet Phoebe, a deacon in Cenchreae, Priscilla, who taught theology alongside her husband Aquila, Eunia, called outstanding among the apostles. Many house churches were led by women. In a world marked by rigid patriarchy, the Christian message that there is neither male nor female struck with revolutionary clarity. Yet, as the church became more institutionalized, these women's voices were gradually erased. Authority shifted toward male bishops and priests. The model of Mary, idealized and untouchable, took the place of real women with authority and agency. Female leadership did not disappear overnight, but it faded from memory, pushed into the margins of ecclesial history. What was lost was not only power, it was perspective, a way of seeing the gospel from a different angle, a gentler, more embodied wisdom. At the same time, the early church was a laboratory of beliefs. Dozens of interpretations of Jesus' life and meaning flourished in the first centuries. Some emphasized his humanity, others his divinity. Some saw him as a wise teacher, others as a cosmic savior. These interpretations were not marginal. They were vibrant, widespread, and often deeply thoughtful. What later came to be called heresy was, in its time, part of the central conversation. Gnostic movements, for instance, spoke of an inner knowledge that freed the soul from a corrupt material world. Ebionites insisted on Jesus' full humanity and fidelity to the Jewish law. Marcionites rejected the God of the Old Testament entirely, claiming that Jesus revealed a wholly new, previously unknown divinity. Each group had its own scriptures, liturgies, and leaders. Christianity was not yet a single path. It was a sprawling forest of ideas and hopes. Over time, the Church began to define itself more strictly. Councils were held. Creeds were written. A canon was established. Orthodoxy emerged, not necessarily because it was the most authentic expression of Jesus' vision, but because it offered structure, unity, and compatibility with empire. And so the question arises, which version of Christianity survived, and why? It was not necessarily the most faithful to Jesus' original teachings. It was the one that proved most resilient, most adaptable, most aligned with institutional power. The Christianity that survived was the one that could build cathedrals, negotiate with emperors, regulate belief, and sustain its message across continents. It was the faith that could become a system, and in doing so, it achieved permanence, but at a cost. What was gained was order, continuity, a shared story. What was lost was diversity, spontaneity, spiritual daring. Whole libraries of alternative gospels, writings, and visions were destroyed or buried. The stories of those communities, their questions, their insights, their struggles, were erased from the official narrative. And yet, in recent decades, many of these voices have been recovered. Through fragments, parchments, memories, through the silence that speaks. Today, the tension between history and faith still remains. We look back and wonder, what might have been? What did we lose when only one path was preserved? And yet, within that preserved tradition, the original spark still burns. The Jesus who comforted the broken and challenged the powerful is still there. The early church, with all its flaws and frictions, still speaks to us, not as a relic but as a beginning, as a reminder that faith was never meant to be frozen, but lived, wrestled with, expanded. In the end, the story of the early churches is not just a chapter in Christian history. It is a mirror. It shows us how belief is born, in conflict, in courage, in the unresolved. It reminds us that orthodoxy was once a fragile decision, that every tradition has its shadows, and that every silence has a story. And above all, it invites us to believe not blindly, but deeply. To know that faith and history do not always walk in perfect step, but together they form the path we still travel.